Beyond 3D.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Beyond 3D. It is a privilege for us at Beyond 3D to be able to talk to this next gentleman who is considered the grandfather of ancient alien studies, amongst other things. He has written many, many books over the years, including Chariots of the Gods, and welcome back to Australia to Mr. Erich von Däniken. So, Erich, it is great to talk to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back in Australia, finally.
How long has it been?
Well, I guess that at least 15 years.
Oh, that long.
That's a while. That is a while. Anyway, Erich, you are here on the Ancient Astronauts Tour. I believe it's sponsored by Nexus Magazine, and you'll be appearing in Melbourne as well as in Sydney and Brisbane, I believe. So if you could, for our listeners, if you could just give a brief synopsis of your background, and we can take it forward to what you are doing in Australia now and how the tour is going to go.
Okay. I'm Erich von Däniken. I'm a Swiss. I was educated in Switzerland in a Catholic boarding school for quite some 6 years. The school was led by Jesuits. So I was a deep believer in God when I was a young man. By the way, I still am a deep believer in God. But my God of my youth had to have some qualities. For example, God makes no mistake. God does not need a vehicle in which to move around from point A to point B, and so on. Now, in this boarding school, we had to translate parts of the Bible from Greek to Latin and from Latin to German. And there I learned that in some parts of the Bible, a God is described which descends on the holy mountain with smoke and fire and trembling and loud noise, and so on. Or the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament describes a God who descends again, and he even describes the noise. He compares the noise with the thundering of a waterfall. He describes the wheels, the legs, the wings, and so on. So the result was I had doubts in my own Catholic education, and I simply wanted to find out if other communities in antiquity have similar stories than we have from the Christian and Jewish tradition. And that was the beginning of my studies. The result was Chariots of the Gods, but that's nearly 45 years ago. In the meantime, I'm 80. And in Chariots of the Gods, I came up with the idea that our planet Earth was visited some thousands and thousands of years ago by extraterrestrials. At that time, our ancestors were Stone Age people. They did not understood what was going on, and they believed, erroneously, that these gods were, these extraterrestrials were some gods. Of course, we all know that there are no gods. That was the misunderstanding. And so this idea of the gods descending to our planet was handed down in mythologies, in legends, and partly in the old religion. That's the main story of Erich von Däniken.
In a sense, Erich, it's, well, you're preaching to the choir here as far as I'm concerned, but as a Catholic, but we had the Franciscans. It was a matter of, looking at religion in general, as I think most kids, especially in the Catholic faith, you would start to question as you hit your teenage years especially, about God, about the entire church, and what was actually going on. And so I can totally agree with where you're coming from in that regard. As far as what it actually was, I did a while ago hear you speak on something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the Indian traditions. And the Indian traditions for me, I lived in India for a year, and I studied the Ramayana, and I studied the Mahabharata and the Srimad Bhagavatam. And when you look at what is being written about those texts in particular, and if you go back to the Upanishads and the Vedas as well, you will find that the gods Krishna, which is the incarnation of Vishnu, Rama, Balarama, all of these people, all of these entities, seemed to have other earthly kind or otherworldly kind of powers that they possessed. And I think as you go back, you would find that most of these gods or these people actually, I can see where a person would believe that they came from off-world in a sense because of the things that they were able to do, and the only way the people of the time could describe it was to describe it as something godly in a sense to them.
That's exactly my point.
Absolutely.
Not only, our ancestors created gigantic buildings For example, temples and pyramids and whatever. And it is not my belief that extraterrestrials created these temples. It was always the humans who did it. My question was, why? What was the reason? What was the purpose? Why did humans take these gigantic works? And the reason is always, well, because of the gods. Okay, which gods? Now, the natural explanation is, well, the gods in nature. You know, our ancestors, Stone Age people, they admired the sun or the moon. They were afraid of an earthquake or of lightning. So they were afraid of natural forces. And that's how they admired the gods. That's okay so far. But these gods I'm talking about, they gave information to us. And in some case, scientific information. For example, concerning mathematics, concerning astronomy, etc. So the difference between the natural gods and the so-called gods from outer space is they were talking. Information was given to the humans. And that's why I say they were extraterrestrials. Our ancestors simply could not understand it.
Erich, I'm curious. I'm assuming you're familiar with the work of Zecharia Sitchin.
Of course, we know each other very well.
Oh, fantastic. Do you subscribe to his ideas of the Anunnaki? Does that sit in well with how you see things?
More or less, yes. What I do not agree with Zecharia Sitchin is the story of the 12th planet. There might be that we have some little planets or planets-like things in our solar system, but not the 12th planet which surrounds the sun in 3,600 years. So in this story, I don't agree with Zecharia Sitchin. Right. In the rest, I absolutely agree with Anunnaki and all. We were slaves, we were misused and misleaded by the extraterrestrials some thousands of years ago.
Yes, because that story sits very nicely with a lot of the things you've presented over the years in your own work, doesn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Excellent. Hey, Erich, it's Clint here. I have a question in regards to the Great Pyramid of Cheops, if you're able to talk about that.
Yes, of course.
It's been calculated that the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt required one stacked block to be laid every couple of seconds around the clock in order to support the theory it was built by slaves over its 20 years of construction. What are your thoughts on the use of such things like sonic levitation as a construction tool in order to complete such technical and intricate jigsaw puzzle?
You see, I'm in contradiction here with Egyptologists.
Yep.
They tell us that the Great Pyramid was constructed by the Pharaoh of Cheops.
Yep.
Cheops is more or less 4,500 years in the past from now on. But Cheops' father, Snorfu, was a Stone Age man. They came out directly by Stonehenge. Now, in the last years, inside the pyramid, many new shafts and rooms have been detected, also under the pyramid. By the way, I show these shafts and rooms in my speech. I have the pictures of all these things. But now that means the planning is becoming more complicated. You see, the planning means engineering. You have to plan a pyramid with many different shafts and rooms inside and under the pyramid, and you have to plan this before you start the building. Now, as I said, Snorfu, Cheops' father, was a Stone Age man. So the engineering, the planning is not there at Cheops' times. Of course, the humans did move these blocks somehow, but the planning, the engineering knowledge came from outside. And here again, you know, there are old Arabian writers which no one knows in the Western world. For example, Ibrahim Abdul Makrisi or Al-Mas'udi, they all tell us that the Great Pyramid was in reality constructed before the Great Flood, and they even say it was made by a king with the name of Saurit. And they say Saurit is the same personality which the Hebrew community call Enoch. Now, Enoch again, that was before the Great Flood. Enoch was the seventh patriarch before the Great Flood. He was in contact with extraterrestrials. They brought him up to a mother spaceship. Enoch describes all this in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not part of the Bible. The Book of Enoch came from the Ethiopian church. So all this is described. Enoch learns the language of the extraterrestrials. He teaches the human, and they gave him the plans, the engineering knowledge to construct the pyramid, because they say inside the Great Pyramid is all the knowledge of Enoch, all the books which the extraterrestrials have dictated him. So it should be all inside the pyramid, and the order was make a construction which is strong enough to survive the Great Flood. The pyramid was made before the Great Flood. So all this knowledge is contradicting our archaeological knowledge, where they believe it was made by Cheops. I think it is not possible just because of the planning. The engineering work cannot be done at Cheops' time.
Erich, that's fantastic, and I agree with you on all those points, but I do have a question in regards to one of the corridors. There's a particular corridor that's about 14 centimetres in diameter, and you used a Jedi remote robot to investigate those corridors, which they're obviously too small for a man or a child to climb into. Yet at the end of the greatest corridor, you discovered non-hieroglyphic text that was etched into the wall. Almost impossible for Egyptians to have written at the time. Does anybody yet know what this body of text reads as?
You are not completely sure. We are not completely sure if the inscriptions are really texts. Okay. They look like, but nobody was able to translate it. It just, you will see it in my speech. It's just on a wall, some red, you can call it writings, but it's definitely not hieroglyphic. Now in Cheops' times, they would have written in hieroglyphics. So it was not Cheops. And you see, all that story here is becoming more complicated and more complicated. First, the discovery of the shaft, which was 62 meters long, was made by Rudolf Gantenbrink, a German engineer, which constructed the robot. I show this robot and how he's crossing to this shaft. Then came some sort of door. Then National Geographic from the United States made a hole throughout the door. Then came the next wall. Then another robot was used. The name is Jedi. And Jedi made another small hole, just big enough for an endoscope. And there they put some endoscope through the wall, and they found a new room behind it with that kind of writing, whatever it is. You will see it in my speech, and everyone can make his own opinion. What is it? I have no answer. But definitely it's not hieroglyphic.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Erich.
Erich, if I may, we can wax philosophic about all of these kinds of things, but I just want to, let's get down to the basics. Based upon all of the work you have done, where would you date the pyramids?
God, you see, in ancient time, 450 BC, there was a Greek historian. His name was Herodotus. Herodotus was also in Egypt, and Herodotus was in Thebes. Thebes is today's city of Luxor on the Nile. And Herodotus tells us that the high priest showed him 241 statues, one statue next to the other. And the high priest gave an explanation to every statue. And at the end, the high priest said, these 241 statues represent 11,340 years. At that time, the gods from the sky have been among the humans. Since that time, the gods have not returned. So Herodotus made this statement about 2,500 years from now, and he says 11,340 years. So we have to add the 2,500 years from now to the 11,340. That means roughly 14,000 years ago. So 14,000 years ago, the gods were among the humans, and at that time, the pyramid should be constructed, according at least to Herodotus and to Theodore and other antique writers.
Beyond 3 D.
Hi, I'm Matt Adams. Welcome to another edition of Beyond 3D. We live in strange and disturbing times. It's very interesting out there. It's the time when nuclear power rules, depending on the country you're in. And they believe this nuclear age is new. But is it new? Is this the only time in the history of the planet where the atom, where nuclear power has been used? Was the first time an atomic weapon was used? Was the first time in Japan? Or did something else happen? Many studies are being conducted. A lot of research is being done around the world right now, chasing our ancient past, trying to find out whether or not, in some way, shape, or form, our ancient ancestors had technology that we today believe they could not have possibly attained. Is this the first nuclear age? You can hear many stories in ancient texts about many different things that are going on. The words used in ancient times to describe things can be different to the words we use today. Does that mean that they were ignorant to what was considered to be powerful technology? It's an interesting thought, especially when you start to know and hear about researchers going around this planet and finding that the atom may have been split a heck of a long time ago. Mr. Oppenheimer might not have been the first to create such a weapon. You go around and you hear stories like this one that I'm about to read to you. So take a really good listen, but before I read it, we have to set it up a little bit. Many people in the Christian community read the Bible. Many people in the Muslim community will have the Quran. And in ancient Indian traditions, there are many spiritual texts out there. You have the Upanishads, you have the Vedas, and you have one of my favorite books, all 1.8 million words, more or less, of it, called the Mahabharata, the Indian epic. And as the saying goes, if it is not contained within the words of the Mahabharata, it probably doesn't exist. Therefore, when you read that ancient text and you start to get the descriptions of what was going on, it becomes quite interesting. And when you bring it to our time, to the now, and find out that there are researchers going around through southern Pakistan and northern India, and they have found evidence that weaponry of an extreme nature was used some 12,000 years ago, it really can make you think. Ancient city found in India, irradiated from atomic bomb blast. Radiation still so intense, the area is highly dangerous. A heavy layer of radioactive ash in Rajasthan, India covers a 3 square mile area, 10 miles west of Jodhpur. Scientists are investigating the site, where a housing development was being built. For some time, it has been established that there is a very high rate of birth defects and cancer in the area under construction. Radiation levels there have registered so high on investigators' gauges that the government itself has now cordoned off the region. Scientists have unearthed an ancient city where evidence shows an atomic blast dating back thousands of years, from 8,000 to 12,000 years to be precise, destroyed most of the buildings and probably 500,000 people. One researcher estimates that the nuclear bomb used was about the size of the ones dropped on Japan in 1945. In the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, it clearly describes a catastrophic blast that rocked the continent. In the Mahabharata, you had 2 warring families. You had the Pandavas and you had the Kauravas. Cousins. Yet those cousins were fighting over the kingdoms. And they had a great war. That great war was described in detail. It is called the Battle of Kurukshetra, and it is well documented the kind of weaponry that was used. You get quotes from the Mahabharata like this: a single projectile charged with all the power in the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes an entire race. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Their hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without any apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape this fire, the soldiers that survived threw themselves into the river. Many historians have made comments on this area and the references that are found in the Mahabharata. One historian said that Indian sacred writings are full of such descriptions which sound like an atomic blast as experienced in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He says references mention flying sky chariots and final weapons. An ancient battle is described in the Drona Parva, a section of the Mahabharata. The passage tells of combat where explosions of the final weapons decimate entire armies, causing crowds of warriors with steeds and elephants and weapons to be carried away as if they were dry leaves of trees. Instead of mushroom clouds, the writer describes a perpendicular explosion with its billowing smoke clouds as consecutive openings of giant parasols. There are comments about the contamination of food and of people's hair falling out. Archaeologist Francis Taylor says that etchings in some of the nearby temples he has managed to translate suggest that they prayed to be spared from the great light that was coming to lay ruin to the city. It's so mind-boggling to imagine that some civilization had nuclear technology before we did. The radioactive ash adds credibility to the ancient Indian records that describe atomic warfare. There is evidence that the Rama Empire, now India, was devastated by nuclear war. The Indus Valley is now the Thar Desert, and the site of the radioactive ash found west of Jodhpur is around there. Once again, consider the verses from the Mahabharata. A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns rose in all its splendor, a perpendicular explosion with its billowing smoke clouds, the cloud of smoke. Rising after its first explosion, formed into expanding round circles like the opening of a giant parasol. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Handakas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. The hair and the nails fell out. The pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment. Until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, modern mankind could not imagine any weapon as horrible and as devastating as those described in the ancient Indian texts. Yet they very accurately describe the effects of an atomic explosion. Radioactive poisoning will make hair and nails fall out. Immersing oneself in water gives some respite, though it's not a cure. When excavations of the ancient cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan reached the street level, they discovered, scattered about the cities, many skeletons. Many of those skeletons were held in hands and sprawling in the streets as if some instant, horrible doom had taken place. People were just lying unburied in the streets of the city. And these skeletons are thousands of years old, even by traditional archaeological standards. What could cause such a thing? Why did the bodies not decay or get eaten by wild animals? Furthermore, there is no apparent cause of a physically violent death. These skeletons are among the most radioactive ever found, on a par with those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At one site, Soviet scholars found a skeleton which had a radioactive level 50 times greater than normal. Other cities have been found in northern India that show indications of explosions of great magnitude. One such city found between the Ganga and the mountains of Rajmahal seems to have been subjected to intense heat. huge masses of walls and foundations of the ancient city are fused together, literally vitrified. And since there is no indication of a volcanic eruption at Mohenjo-Daro or at any of the other cities, the intense heat to melt clay vessels can only be explained by an atomic blast or some other unknown weapon. These cities were wiped out in their entirety. While the skeletons have been carbon dated to about 2500 BC, we must keep in mind that carbon dating involves measuring the amount of radiation left. When the atomic explosions are involved, that makes them seem much younger. And final interesting point about this. Manhattan Project scientist Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was known to be familiar with the ancient Indian texts, including the Mahabharata. And in an interview conducted after he watched the first atomic test, he quoted from those texts from the Bhagavad Gita. The quote was, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all felt that way. When asked in an interview several years after the Alamogordo nuclear test whether that was the first atomic bomb ever to be detonated, his reply was, "Ancient cities whose brick and stone walls have literally been vitrified, that is, fused together, can be found in India, Ireland, Scotland, France, Turkey, and other places. There is no logical explanation for the vitrification of stone forts and cities except from an atomic blast." This is Beyond 3D.
Beyond 3D. Okay, Matt and Steve. So today I'd like to talk, and Matt, I know you know a little bit about this as well. Ancient Sumer. For those listeners at home that aren't that faux pas with Sumer, it was one of the ancient civilizations in historical regions in southern Mesopotamia, which today is known as modern-day southern Iraq, and is generally considered the cradle of civilization, isn't it?
Yep.
Modern histories have suggested that Sumer was first permanently settled between, I think from memory it was about 5,500 or 4,000 years before Christ.
Right.
Yep. That said, we can fast forward potentially 7,000 years and talk about another gentleman called Hans Lippershey, who is a Dutchman who was the first person to apply for a patent for the first telescope.
Okay.
And he was an eyeglass maker who built this device, and it was said it had over 3 times magnification, and that was the patent back in 1608. Now, the reason I say 1608 is because the one person that we associate with the chronicling of our solar system would be Galileo. Galilei is commonly credited for inventing the telescope, but this is not accurate. Galileo was the first to use a telescope for the purpose of astronomy in 1609, so that was a year after Hans Lippershey put the patent out there to develop that. And 1609, in which Galileo first attempted to begin mapping our known solar system. So the reason I throw those dates out there with those people is regular listeners of our show are familiar with the work of Zecharia Sitchin, being the godfather of ancient Sumeria, and one of the only people who can read the ancient Sumerian tablets, which were discovered years ago, that the Sumerians mapped our solar system. It was said 5,000 to 6,000 years before the first telescope was ever invented. How they did that, well, it's Pandora's box, isn't it?
It'll lead to a lot, but see where this goes. But yeah, it was interesting when you were talking about the telescope and patents and things like that. That's similar. That's typical.
That's typical.
Tesla, Edison kind of goodies. And
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I just threw that date out there as 1608 because it was the year before Galileo started mapping the universe, the solar system.
Right.
But Sitchin discovered that ancient Sumer had a way of doing it and had help in mapping our known solar system. What did I say, 5,000, 6,000 years before the first telescope was ever invented. So I'm just going to play you a little grab now of Zecharia laying it all out for us. So here we go.
Authors like Zecharia Sitchin have gone to the far ends of the earth looking for clues, painstakingly piecing together enough fragmentary evidence to build a new theory of human evolution.
A basic conclusion of my writings has been that those who gave mankind civilization were visitors to Earth from another planet. If I say extraterrestrials, it's a dirty word, but that's what they were. This is called a...
Sitchin is one of the few people on Earth able to read 6,000-year-old Sumerian texts. These writings, according to Sitchin, contain unmistakable clues to ancient intergalactic space travel.
And in order to come and go between them, their planet and our planet, they needed a space facility. The space facility was in a place in Mesopotamia, in today's Iraq. The mission control center was at a place called Nippur, and the actual spaceport was in a place called Sipar, which can be translated as Bird City. Many of them were depicted as birdmen with wings.
According to some experts, we can find very detailed information on UFOs and aliens in the old Sumerian culture, now considered to be the cradle of our civilization. The people then had extraordinary astronomical knowledge. Zecharia Sitchin.
If somebody says, where did you get the idea? I say, I read the Sumerian tablets, and that's what they say. They said that our solar system is made up of 12 members. And this is stated in the Sumerian text over and over and over again, not one time. And they say there is the sun, which is in the center, not like the Greeks or others thought that the earth is in the center, the sun. There's the moon, which they gave reasons why they considered it a member by its own, and 10, not 9, but 10 planets. Therefore, I'm very happy that when today astronomers look for this planet, they call it Planet X. They mean maybe the unknown planet, but it's also the 10th planet. They called it Nibiru, which means planet of the crossing, and the ancient symbol was the cross, not from Christian times, but from 6,000 years ago. And they say that this planet, the 12th member of our solar system, has a very large orbit of 3,600 years, and every 3,600 years it comes between Mars and Jupiter close to us. And it is then, they said, that people that look like us, not with little horns or green, people that look like us started to come between their planet and Earth about 450,000 years ago. Why do they look like us? We look like them. Because if you know the Bible, which is based on the Sumerian tales, at some point they engaged in genetic engineering and mixed their genes with the genes of Homo erectus. We can use various scientific terms, but let's say with early hominids to bring about Homo sapiens, us.
The Maya and Incas of South America believed a race of giants existed on Earth before the Great Flood. So did many other ancient civilizations. Some took them for gods. Others left likenesses of them in stone or wrote about them in their histories. As long as 6,000 years ago, Another remarkable civilization evolved. Its people were the Sumerians, who had an extraordinarily advanced culture.
Their list of first just almost sounds like a whole list of our whole society. They had the first bicameral Congress, they had the first writing, they had the first school systems, and you just go on and on and on. So you have to ask, well, where did all this come from? And I think that you need to turn to the ancient Sumerians themselves and listen very carefully to what they have to say, because what they have to say, not just in one place, but over and over and over again, is that they were taught civilization by these beings that came from the heavens to the earth. They called them the Anunnaki.
The Sumerians wrote down their history on clay tablets like these, which lay ignored in a Berlin museum for half a century. Few people have been able to decipher this ancient language, but one of them is Zecharia Sitchin.
The writings and the pictorial evidence left behind by the Sumerians going back 6,000 years speak and depict people who came from another planet called Nibiru, and many of the depictions show them much bigger, at least by a third, perhaps more than the average human being, so they were giants.
This Sumerian cylinder seal from a Berlin museum is astonishing for several reasons. First, it depicts our solar system with the sun at the center and the planets arrayed around it, a fact not known to European science till around 300 years ago. It also shows the planet Pluto, which we didn't discover till 1930. And amazingly, there's another planet, which the Sumerians called Nibiru, and believed that it was from where the Anunnaki, or celestial giants, came from.
If you look at the three figures depicted here, they all look more or less the same size. But if you bear in mind that this figure of the deity, that he is seated, and you add from the knee to the hip to his size, you will realize that he is about 10 feet tall, a giant, one of those who from heaven to earth came.
Looking for signs of extraterrestrial life, astronomers have searched deeper and deeper into the universe. But all along, maybe they should have been looking closer to home. For it's in our own solar system that a mysterious object has recently been detected, near where the Sumerians placed their planet Nibiru, home of the Anunnaki. For the believers, this is convincing evidence that the celestial giants are real.
The ancient Sumerian text, just in a very broad overview, basically tell us that more than 400,000 years ago that these Anunnaki came from space and landed on the earth in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They began to set up a colony that they called Eden.
According to Genesis, Eden, or Eden, is where Adam was created from dust and Eve from one of his ribs. Others, however, have a more high-tech version of how human life began.
In time, needing manpower, needing workers, jumped the gun on evolution using genetic engineering.
And they produced a hybrid which eventually became Cro-Magnon or modern man.
Legend has it that when the Anunnaki came back after several thousand years to see how their genetic handiwork had turned out, they found the Earth females irresistibly attractive.
It starts in the Bible. There you can read, in the beginning at Moses, when the sons of the gods saw that the daughter of man were beauty, they took them to wife. Later, out of the body's womb, giants came.
So destructive were these titans that the Anunnaki who fathered them decided to destroy them. The apocryphal book of Baruch even tells us how many giants were wiped out.
The book of Baruch says, "Then the Lord created the great flood, destroyed all life, which then was on earth, including the 4,090,000 giants."
Beyond, three, And now we return to our exclusive interview with Erich von Däniken.
I actually want to ask the question which brings us back into the now and possibly looking into the future. Now, when you came on the scene with this information about 45 years ago, it was a revelation to a lot of people. Now it's a bit more common, what with shows like Ancient Aliens on the History Channel and a lot of shows like that. A lot of people are very familiar with this work now. Where do you think this work is taking us into the future, Erich?
Well, it's bringing us to a new consciousness, a new way of thinking. You know, on Earth, generally spoken, we have two types of humans in our society. One type of humans is religious. It doesn't matter what kind of religion. The religious people have been taught that God made everything. God made the planets, God made the plants, God made the living trees and so on. But finally, God, as the crown of creation, He made us, the humans. The second type of human are the scientific community. They believe it's all evolution, mutation, selection, but we are on the top of evolution. So in both cases, if you look at it religiously, crown of creation, or scientifically, top of evolution, in both cases we look at us as the greatest. There's nothing out there like us, and this has to be changed. You ask, where does this idea of extraterrestrials bring us? It makes us more modern, more modest. We have to learn we are not the only intelligent being in this universe. There are other intelligent forms of life. Some of them are more advanced than we. We have to learn this, and then we are ready for a possible contact with them. As long as we think we are the greatest, we are not ready. We are against the extraterrestrials.
Fascinating.
Here they come. Hello.
Yes, Erich. Okay, there was one other question I wanted to ask you, and that was about your writings, and I wanted to know, what have you written lately? I believe I heard that you had a new book coming out.
Well, that's a never-ending story. You see, Chariots of the Gods is now more than 45 years old, and since Chariots of the Gods, I have published 37 other titles, and it's always the same theme. I always say this planet was visited by beings from outer space thousands of years ago. But it's always new indications. It's never the same book. The theme is the same. So I have written books only about the Mayas, written books only about Egypt, written books only about Asia, and so on, to support my case with indications. Of course, indications are never a complete proof. I have never found an extraterrestrial object until today. I would be proud to present an extraterrestrial object to the scientific community and say, hey, here now we have a final proof. But we have a proof by indication. Hundreds and hundreds of indications in the old writings, in the sculptures, in the temples, in the buildings. They all together make this picture. We were visited by beings from outer space. And these visitors have promised, when they were here, that they will return in the future. You know, when Francisco Pizarro was the conqueror of the Inca kingdom in South America and Peru. When Francisco Pizarro for the first time arrived in Peru, the natives believed that he was the long-awaited god. So they believed he was a returning god. The same thing happened in Central America. For example, Hernando Cortés, he was the conqueror of Central America. He came together with the Aztec king Moctezuma. Moctezuma believed that Cortés was the long-awaited god. The same thing happened in the South Sea. James Cook, for example. The natives always believed that they were the gods they were expecting long time ago. So this expectation of the returning of someone is not a Christian invention. That was living long before Christianity. And what about today? I'm educated as a Catholic, and we Christians, we wait for the returning of Jesus. But the Muslim society has the same belief. They believe that the Mahdi will one day return. As we know, the Buddhist society is waiting for the return of Buddha. As we all know, the great Jewish community is waiting for the returning of Messiah. So not only the cultures who died, also our living religions still believe that someone will return. Now, honestly, not every religion can be right. Some of them must be wrong. What if they are all wrong? I think it's not Jesus or Buddha or Mahdi who returns, it's simply extraterrestrials. And if they return, we have a catastrophe on the planet. We are shocked. That's why I think it makes sense to take our point of view into consideration. Look at it with new eyes, and maybe you came to the same answer as we. And then we are not afraid anymore if they return. And they will return. Maybe they are even here. Nobody knows for sure.
Well said. Well said.
Hey, sorry, Eric. Another quick question. When do you actually believe that they will return? I mean, with all the information that does cross your path and all the people that you do know in your circles.
In ancient writings, we have several promises that the gods return. I was mentioning the prophet Enoch before. Enoch, finally, he left our planet with the extraterrestrials in the fiery chariot. But before he leaves our planet, he comes together again with his family on Earth. And one of his sons is Methuselah, the biblical Methuselah. And Methuselah asked his father Enoch, "Will I see you again?" And he says to Methuselah, the guardians of the sky told me that I will return to Earth again. But thousands of years have passed, so we will not meet each one again. The same story you have in Tibetan mythology, that some gods promise to return in a future. So when it is, nobody knows. But I think it has to be more or less in the next 20 years. And as I just said before, maybe they are here. You know, at the end of my speech, I will show you a short UFO film. The film was made by an aircraft pilot, which was in a fighter, an aircraft pilot. And you see the object absolutely clear. And you ask yourself, what is going on here? Are we already visited? Is somebody watching us? Is somebody studying our language? Is somebody studying, who are we? Are we dangerous? Have we maybe developed weapons which could be dangerous for them? What kind of bacteria do we have? So it could be that at the moment we are under observation. Somebody is observing us like a scientific community and making an analysis.
That would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? Yes.
It would make sense to me, based on everything that we've seen lately and everything that's going on. Eric, do you have any opinion on what's going on now as far as NASA is concerned with the missions to Pluto and Ceres, the planets out there?
No, I read the story in the newspapers only. I hope that every day they make new discoveries.
Yeah, so do I. I found it very interesting that the probe around the dwarf moon Ceres, all of a sudden, as soon as it got within about 250 nautical miles of the planet, stopped working. I thought that was quite suspect on my, but I haven't seen the latest photos from Pluto yet, so hopefully they'll find something up there interesting as well.
I didn't hear that. So they were stopping? I didn't know that before.
It literally, a couple of days back, as it approached as it got close to Ceres, because they saw some light kind of structures there, something they were saying it could have been ice. It literally, there was a malfunction with the systems, and they're waiting now to reboot the system so they can come in closer and get a closer look at that area.
Wow.
So anybody that normally knows what NASA could be about or anything like that, a lot of the conspiracy theorists will say, well, they stopped it on purpose because they found something they didn't want to let out yet, but who knows? Anything is possible. It could just actually be a computer glitch as well. So, yeah, that was what was going on. So now, Eric, this trip for you, you're going to be speaking in Melbourne, Sydney, and in Brisbane.
I'm talking here, I think, next Friday. This coming Friday.
Here
in Melbourne,
actually.
at the Athenaeum.
Yes.
Athenaeum Theatre.
At the Athenaeum, yes, exactly. So you will be discussing, I guess, many different subjects. Of late, being that you are constantly working and you are constantly exploring, researching out there, can you share with us any little tidbit, any little bit of information that you've recently discovered in the last 3 months that has actually astounded you?
Well, the newest discovery is always under the Great Pyramid. Again, I have to refer to Herodotus, the Greek historian, 450 BC. He also told us that under the Great Pyramid there is a lake, a sea, and in the sea there is a sarcophagus covered by water. Now, among archaeologists, they said this is all rubbish, this is impossible. There cannot be a sea near the pyramid. In the meantime, the sea has been discovered and found. Of course, I was down there with my people and my camera, and I will show it. So Herodotus was right at that time. And the other stuff is Nazca in Peru. You know this desert with these gigantic lines. There always new things are discovered, new figures, and new mathematical forms which were not known before because they are in the nearby mountains near Nazca. And what I just heard yesterday, they even discovered a pyramid now near Nazca, but it's not archaeologically discovered. They simply know that there is a pyramid in the ground. So always new stuff is coming up. This is a never-ending story. I am happy because I was successful. I was lucky enough to be successful worldwide. That's why many people write me, tell me information, send me information. They ask me, hell, Mr. von Däniken, why did you not mention our local stuff? And I reply and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know about it. So I go there, and before I write something, I want to see it, smell it, touch it. I want to be sure that it does exist. And before I write about something, I always want to know what do the local archaeologists say to this certain discovery. So it's a never-ending story, and it's wonderfully, I'm fascinated. I'm in the meantime, by the way, 80 years ago old, but the gods love me. My brain functions perfectly.
That's the way.
We call it 80 years young, Eric.
Oh, God.
Absolutely. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I greatly appreciate the time that you've given us on Beyond 3D. So from myself and from Clint and from Steve, we thank you. We welcome you to Australia, and we hope that every success happens for you during this tour. So Erich von Däniken, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for being your guest with you. Thank you for the show. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Beyond 3D. Well, that was an amazing interview, wasn't it there, Matt?
Excellent, actually. Great to talk to somebody like Erich von Däniken.
Well, that was sensational. And next week, Matt, what do we have lined up?
Next week on Beyond 3D, we'll have the beginning of an in-depth interview with great publisher from Nexus Magazine, Duncan Rhodes. So we're looking forward to that as well.
Duncan brings up a lot of left of field. that is a sensational interview. I can't wait because I know what's coming.
Far afield, it'll be fantastic.
So far from left, it becomes right again.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
So everybody out there, we will catch you all next week for the next edition of Beyond 3D. Until then, take care of yourselves.
Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.